Welcome to the Modern Therapist's Guide to Nothing.
What's up, everybody? This is Dave. I'm here with Greg. We're your co-hosts on this magical carpet ride. And today's quite the journey. Quite the journey indeed. Greg, will you let these fine people know what they're in store for today?
Hey, Dave. Today we're going to be talking about a man who is a huge influence. I think I can get away with saying that and speak for the both of us, right? An influence to you and I. Viktor Frankl. And this is, it's interesting because this kind of came up last week. This man was a psychiatrist in the 30s in the area of Adler and Freud, a contemporary with Jung. Like, these guys are all operating in the same time frame, and most of them in the same city, which is just unbelievable, right?
Yeah.
So
these were the true pioneers of the game, right?
The pioneers, right? Like, these are like especially you can't even say especially Adler, Freud. So Jung was in Switzerland, but he was around a lot of the times, and like Frankl, they're like all in this same area, like working together. And Frankl had this idea. He had this like untested theory about a form of psychotherapy that he was going to start to use. And
I know what it was called.
What's that?
I know what it was called.
What was it called, Dave?
Frankl therapy.
That's right. Just a bit outside on that one.
Oh, okay.
It was actually called logotherapy. And what that was is, that logos comes from the Greek word meaning. And it's just his idea that he thought that meaning, the will to meaning, was the driving force for human behavior. And like finding meaning in our lives was the most important thing. And he would get a chance to test this theory in the most strenuous environment possible. And I think that we could agree that would be the Holocaust, right?
So, Greg, just to give people context, and if they didn't listen to the Dreams episode, please go back and listen to that episode where we kind of talked about Freud, Jung, and Adler, these like up and coming psychologists, therapists coming up at this time. And now we're adding Frankl into the mix. And like, if Adler is Jay-Z, if Jung is Nas, and Freud is Biggie, I mean, Frankl's got to be Tupac. Like, these are the big names of the game here.
Although I would probably give Freud the Tupac position.
Okay.
If we're agreeing that Tupac is the best.
I do agree that Tupac is the best.
Yeah,
that's why I gave it to Frankl.
Oh, okay. So that's our thoughts. We think Frankl's the best. I this is a guy who spent 3 years. He did something that none of the rest of them did. He spent 3 years in concentration camps. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the insights that he writes down in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, which he wrote in like 9 days.
Yeah. This book is super important. And the reason why we're doing this episode, and we started the episode talking about how this episode is about Frankl, but in actuality, our episode is actually about Man's Search for Meaning, because this is the primary focus of this. But that's not the title of the book. So Greg, you know what, dude? You are so good. You are so good. Look at you. You've changed since a couple episodes ago. Yeah. Which I won't bring up.
Okay.
So
I'm trying.
So
I'm growing.
Good on you, Greg. Good on you.
Thank you.
Individual Search for Meaning is a great book that we have now renamed. And, this book, I feel, has become super important to us, not just because it's helped us in our view of the world, but like, Greg, I don't know about you, but I can't think of a patient that I've worked with, except for maybe my like 9 and 10-year-olds, but even maybe them, that like I haven't mentioned this, like the themes of this book or this book itself too.
Yeah, I think that, well, even like if you even talk about just the book, just even in the prologue, you can kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here when he talks about how when he's in therapy, the first thing he's going to ask people is,
have you read
why did you not commit suicide yet?
Oh, I thought it was going to be, have you read my book?
Which is like, I mean, Dave, that's a huge, like sort of staggering comment.
Yeah.
And like, what is the use of asking someone something like that?
How often do you ask people that question?
I don't know if I've asked, and then I always sort of back it up with the reason why I ask is,
Yeah.
I think that for me to know why you're still here is going to tell me like what's important to you, what gives your life meaning, what kind of ties you to the earth, what keeps you here.
I think sometimes I genuinely like asking that question without giving explanation and just like kind of leaving the silence,
Oh, you do?
because I do, I sort of do. And it's like not a sick and twisted joke. It's because it does make people think for a second, like really hard, like, wow, did he really just ask me that? And also, well, what is the reason?
Yeah,
And then
and
when
they're
you explain it,
hopefully,
they're, they'll kind of make sense of it and they'll come up with their explanation. But like sometimes you get really pure and genuine answers when you don't say anything to explain the question.
it gives you it gives you a building place when it's serious. That's a question you use when things have gotten really serious and it's been talked about. And another insight before we get into the book, he loves this quote by Nietzsche, and it's, to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in suffering.
Yeah.
So he who can bear with almost any how, so it's like if you have a why, you can bear it with almost any how, is what he's saying. And I think of it like this, Dave. If you picture, a house with a moat around it, right? And the moat is filled with sharks and alligators and all these things. And I say, Dave, can you run in there and get my wallet? You're not going to cross a moat filled with alligators and sharks to get my wallet.
Yeah.
So there's no meaning in that. But if I'm like, Dave, your mother is in there, you don't need like all these weird interventions. You don't need these worksheets. You're going to find a way to get through that moat, through the sharks and through the alligators, because there's something meaningful to you there. So you're just going to find a way to make it happen. So you have to find their big reason, their why, that they should change what makes, like, what they find meaning in. And I think that's really sort of obvious, but Frankl was the first one to kind of think this is where we all, like, what drives us is what we find meaning in. And think about when we were talking about dreams again, to bring that up, like, even when we're asleep, we're searching for meaning.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
One of the things that I really appreciate that he does is he identifies what the opposite of having a meaning is.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this equation, which I find to be really helpful. D equals S minus M. And that is despair equals suffering minus meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's such a powerful statement or equation, because we've all probably been there at some point in time where we felt super low and we didn't understand or have a purpose or a meaning. And it's hard to envision like why we're doing anything at that point. So it's like when you don't have that meaning, it's really hard to see like a way out of something, or to see like, how this can go on.
Like in the book, and we're skipping ahead here, but a good point to illustrate what you're saying is he talks about how he finds a way to make all the humiliation and the beatings and the work, like, how are you getting through this every day? And the idea is he thought of, he could make a bargain with God in his head that the more humiliation, suffering he takes, the safer his wife is going to be. So he made it so, even though it's not real, I mean, maybe he felt that way, he was in a very difficult situation, but he made those beatings and that harsh treatment, he gave it some meaning. Like, I'm going to bear this so my wife can survive. And it doesn't matter if it's real or not, or if it's just something that you're hoping for, because hope's another important element. Like, you have to have a reason to get through something. It's important.
So, and it's interesting because hope is missing. Hope is not possible if we don't have meaning, if we don't have purpose. So in order to have any hope or optimism, you actually have to be kind of, I guess, in a sense, working towards something.
Yeah.
Or finding value in something. So that's what we're talking about when we say, like, somebody comes in and we ask them that question, like, why, you're stating that you're suicidal or that you want to commit self-harm. Well, what's prevented you from doing that so far? That's what we're trying to identify. What is that thing? Another way that I word it when someone's maybe not at that level yet is, what gets you out of bed during the every day? Like, what gets you to work? what gets you to anything that you do within your day. Most of us have a reason that we get up and do something.
Even if it's a responsibility.
Yes.
You know,
100%.
because Frankl will say that across from the Statue of Liberty on the West Coast, there should be a statue of responsibility because, you know, the freedom to do whatever you want is one thing, but like responsibility really does provide meaning in your life.
Yeah.
It really does. But before we get there, I like that you brought up values, because when he first gets to the camp, he noticed something right away. He makes the statement, and this is his quote, "The best of us would not return." And what he's saying is there's people all around him, that there's children on the ground, there's old ladies and old men that are being whipped. And most people are just turning the cheek and not looking at that. But the people who kept to their values, they did something about it. And that most times it cost them their lives. So that's why he says like the best of us didn't make it. And he would think to himself at that point, like, wow, you really have to abandon your morals and your values to survive. But towards the end, he realizes if you do that, if you do abandon your morals and the values and the things that are inside of you that help you make your choices, like, do you really survive? Like something survives,
right?
But it's not really you.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge, important lesson, like that we learn right off the bat in this book.
So, I mean, we've talked about that from time to time, where when you go against your values, that feeling that you get of incongruence, and it just doesn't feel, you don't feel genuine. You don't feel like you're making choices based on who you are as a person. And there's been moments in Frankl's life where he had to make really hard decisions, and he based those decisions on his values, which I think is what makes this book, so valuable to everybody. To hear somebody who can honestly give, like, he can say that he practiced what he preached 100%.
That's what I was going to say. Like, it's one thing to have these values, and we talked about The Fall, that Camus book, and we talked about how you can think that you have all these values and that you're going to act a certain way when put in a certain situation. But what Frankl did here was, you know, he proved it. And he proved, so that's why, like, when I think of existential therapy, when I think of logotherapy, there's a lot of weight behind it because they tested it during the Holocaust in a concentration camp. It's like, it's unbelievable. It's like one of the most important texts ever, I think, you know? Yeah. And so he gets there. Just to get back to where, you know, I love all these little like insights that he has. Like one thing he notices, and think about this, he shows up there and he says like the first phase is like shock. He says that there's like an inborn optimism in all of us as people. And like, we have this delusion that we're going to be saved somehow. Like this isn't possible. Like, can you imagine being in the concentration camp and, you know, they're treating you this way? You must feel on some level like this can't go on for any amount of time. Like someone has to notice this.
It would be amazing to kind of be able to get a sense of what they were feeling about that. Like there must have been that feeling, like I said, it must have been that feeling like either this is the end of the world or how long is this going to last? Like maybe if I wait it out, it will end. Right?
Yeah. And then he starts to notice things that scare him a little bit. He notices that the Jewish people are working in the gas chambers, and the only way that they're able to kind of get through this kind of work, they're killing each other.
Other members, yeah.
It's like, you know, the SS gave them alcohol and kept them completely intoxicated.
Yeah. So Greg, right there, that's a perfect example of somebody in order to survive, they're going against their values. Yeah. And what he's pointing out in that is, how can you continue to live with yourself and feel like you're actually yourself if you betray yourself?
Mm-hmm.
It's so unauthentic, disingenuous.
So in order to live with yourself, you have to, even the SS realizes we have to give them a way to kind of live with this self-deceit. They have to give them alcohol so they can't feel or think about what they're doing. I mean, this is all in like the first moments. This is just after, you know, you're walking in, and we hear, you know, the stories of Mengele pointing a finger, and one way decides your existence and the other way is like certain death. It's like a point of a finger. And Frankl at this moment is carrying this manuscript of what this book would eventually be. And it's helping him stand up straight because he's trying to hide it.
Mhm.
And that's what might have been what saved his life, because he's already an established doctor. He's not young.
Yeah.
He's like maybe in his 40s when this is happening, and he lives,
Yeah.
Into his 90s. But so like he just made it. Like this book saved his life and potentially saved, thousands of lives. The fact that he was able to himself survive. Like the book, the manuscript that he had on him obviously is not going to survive, but the idea stayed in his head.
Yeah. So that manuscript was confiscated, as all belongings were, right?
Yeah.
And destroyed. And that must have been devastating. This work that he's been, that he has this idea in his head that he knows will help people. He knows will be able to create change and instill, all these positive feelings in people of how to get through really tough times. And then it's just taken away.
Yeah. But Dave, do you think maybe that's part of what kept him alive? Like this unfinished work, like that's the part of why like the meaning that he was writing in that book became the meaning like in his life. Like, I need to finish this work, and this is why I need to survive this.
Yeah.
So he had a reason to keep going.
It turned into his purpose, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So, and it's funny because like my first initial walk through this book, I found some of like what his meanings were. And then as I was kind of going through it again, I realized there's more than just one thing. Mm-hmm. He finds multiple meanings and purposes. And I think one of the things that holds true is like, and he identifies this, is your meaning and your purpose will change over time.
Absolutely.
It's not always going to be the same. So, if you're working with someone, or if you're even thinking about yourself in that aspect, it's a good thing to like check in with someone. So Absolutely. Like you might ask that question to somebody one month, and the next month might be a totally different thing. Or it might not, depending on the person. Everybody's different. It's all individual. What's meaningful to me is not going to be meaningful to you, Greg, or any of the listeners. We are all individuals. And I think he does a great job of understanding that everybody's individual.
And, so he's in a position where he's in this, I guess it's sort of like an experiment, the way he's looking at it. Yeah. And he's able to do a lot of things. Like even we talk about limiting beliefs all the time. And he was able to disprove textbooks through, like it was thought that you could only survive so long without sleep. All right, well, that's going to be put to the test. And it turns out you can survive a lot longer without sleep than he thought. He thought that, if you wore dirty clothes all the time, you'd be filled with sores and bacteria, but that didn't really take place either. No toothbrush, but his gums were healthier than ever. Like he was like just really being like a scientist about this. And I think that's what helped him too. Mm-hmm. But over time, like this kind of novelty and shock wears off and a sort of apathy sets in. I would say that would be like the second phase of what happens to people. So he could see these horrible things. I think he makes a reference to a 12-year-old being, tortured, and he's just kind of seeing it. And after the kid's killed, he just like eats the kid's soup. And he notices that about himself. And maybe that's like a necessary mechanism of survival where, if you're in that deplorable of a situation, you lose the ability to feel. But that just goes back to his point. The best of us didn't make it.
Right.
Because if you're able to witness that, and he admits that himself, like when he says the best of us didn't make it, he includes himself in that. Because there's times like that where he could have really done something and it wouldn't have done any good. It wouldn't have saved the boy or himself. But he did have to step outside of his own values. And the fact that he's writing it down and talking about it all these years later, it did affect him.
Yeah, absolutely.
He also talks about like the things that hurt. Like it's not just the injustice. It's not just the abuse and the pain from the beatings that were the worst thing. I think that he mentions what really hurts about this is they're treated like animals and dehumanized. Mm-hmm. And it's like,
yeah. So the part of this story that I love is he makes it very clear in the beginning, this is not just a recount of what it's like to be in concentration camps.
Right.
So what is this about? If anything, to me, I find this to be about the human spirit. Uh-huh. And what he does so frequently in that book is highlight how resilient we are as humans. So there's points, like he makes the point that despite these conditions, I mean, we're talking about 20-hour work days. For food, they're getting like a small piece of bread once in a while, getting, something additional. But for the most part, it's like minimal food,
Barefoot in the snow.
barefoot. But surprisingly, and like, I love that realization that he has. Surprisingly, you look around and you would assume everybody would be miserable, but people are laughing.
Mm-hmm.
Hope is still alive. The human spirit is still alive in this concentration camp, where you would walk in and assume you would just see despair.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing he points out is, once despair happens, once people lose their meaning and their purpose, that's when you start to see them go.
Yeah.
That's when you lose them.
Yeah, 100%.
So they hang on to that. They all hang on to their spirit as a survival technique.
There's a great story that he mentions in the book that points out what you're saying. And he tells a story about a guy who he had a dream that they were going to be liberated on March 31st. And then all of a sudden he had this hope and this usefulness. And he began like walking in the snow with his frostbitten feet, and he was working hard and he seemed optimistic. And then that date came and he died immediately, like a couple of days later, because he lost that meaning. Like he put all in one spot. See, like, and that's an important lesson. Like, these meanings that we have, it has to be malleable. Like, the goals must be able to be changed, and it's not important that you always reach that goal. It's important that we're always working towards it.
Yeah.
And Frankl talks a lot about,
Greg, so that what you just said, say that one more time.
It's not important that we reach the goal. It's important that we're always working towards a goal.
Thank you. So that statement right there is a really, really important thing, because his thought process is, we should not pursue success or achievement. It should ensue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not about the achievement itself. It's about that journey and what we learn along the way and that experience. And like, a great way to highlight that is, like, let's say you're training for something, or you're getting your education for some degree because you want to do a career. So much of that is actually about the journey to that point and all the lessons you learn, but also just like, hey, I got up today and like I ran to go prepare for this race that I want to do, or I completed my first semester of grad school for my degree. So much of it is about just acknowledging those things that you did to get to that goal, whether that goal is achieved in the end or not.
And the goal, even if you do get to the goal, and like the reward isn't like the end of the rainbow, the gold, it's what you've become in the process.
Yeah.
And he talks about this. He's on the train and he sees a little light in the darkness, and he's like he literally sees a light in the darkness, and he realized, like, I there's a light inside of me. I can go inward and live this internal life. And he could do mundane stuff. Like, while he's out, like, they can control like your external world, but there's nothing they can do to control your internal world. And he'll make a big deal of that. Like, he'll say that, you can't control anything that happens to you in your life. All you can control is your reaction to it. Like, the last great human freedom is our ability to choose our attitude towards things. And he learns that, and he uses it. Like, he does mundane stuff in his house. Like, he goes into his apartment. He has this like separate world inside his own brain. And I think that's super interesting. And just to make a quick mention of another doctor that was in the Holocaust, I know we've talked about this before too, but Edith Eger makes that same sort of realization, where she says that you can't banish the darkness of the situation you're in, but you can like strike a light. And she tells that story about how her and her sister came out of the showers and they were shaved, and their parents were smoke in the air in the chimneys. And her sister asks her, like, how do I look? Knowing that she was this once beautiful model type woman, and now she has no hair and she's sad. And Edith looks at her and she's like, wow, like, I never noticed you had such beautiful eyes. So in that moment, she realized she had a choice. I can look at the despair, I can hang out in the despair, and I can give up, or I can always look for what the meaning, what's important here, what's good about the situation, what can I use to get myself out of it. And I think she was like, Viktor Frankl was a huge influence to her in this work. It really helped her. And Frankl also talks a lot about this provisional existence. He talks about being in the camps and what it must be like. It must be like, I don't know, sort of like being unemployed in a sense. But Dave, like, how hard would it be to be in this situation and not knowing when it could end? Now that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes life feel kind of meaningless.
Yeah.
And that's the ultimate, like, that's the downfall. That's what's the hardest thing about this.
So I think one of the interesting things that Frankl does is, in some ways, it feels like he finds his purpose while he's there. So, aside from some of the other things that we'll talk about, one of the purposes he found was actually helping the other inmates in the concentration camp, using the skills he has as a doctor to help others. And that became really important for him. So one of his big messages is, aiming for something bigger than self. So our goals shouldn't always be all about, self-serving goals. We should think about how we can give back, how we contribute to our community, our society. And I think he really encompassed that. So at one point, he actually has the opportunity to escape. And what he chooses is actually to stay, so that, because he felt like he was needed in that camp. He was needed to, his skills were useful. He was able to help the other prisoners. And that gave him that sense of purpose, as we keep talking about. But it's bigger than that too, though. It also goes back to what you were talking about, like not knowing when you could leave. Well, guess what? He actually kind of took some control over that and like had the opportunity to leave. But he takes it into his own hands and he says, no, actually, I'm going to stay and I'm going to do this because this is what's needed. This is my purpose. And I think that gave him a sense of, just being able to have control over what he's willing to do. But this was also that moment where he could have really gone against his values. He could have left everybody behind. He could have been his own version or equivalent of those other individuals who were appointed positions and, like that turned their back on their own people.
Dave, that is a great point. And it goes to show you, like we've talked about in other episodes, with like people who are in horrible conditions and become killers, or like, even the Woodstock one we talked about before, like, wow, are we really that much of a product of our environment? Like, does our environment always control our morality? Like, we've had huge conversations about that. Yeah. But what Frankl shows us in this most extreme situation is we're a little bit more than our environment. Like, we can come out, like we can use our values, and it's pretty amazing that we transcend like our environment and we can live according to our values, even though it might kill us. And I think like if we're like talking to people and people are listening to that, it's like, okay, well, what does this mean for me? Like, how do I find meaning in my own life? And I think what Frankl did is a beautiful example. It's like, who isn't suffering in this world? If you throw a rock, you can hit someone that's suffering. If you can find a way to help alleviate the suffering in one person, other people, I mean, what is a greater meaning than that? What is a greater purpose than that? I can't think of anything. Yeah. And I think that's what we've decided in our lives. Like, we're going to try to do to the best of our ability to help out as many people as we can. And, can we help everyone? No. But have we helped a couple of people? God, I hope so. Yeah. And if we haven't, we're going to keep working towards that.
And it's so funny because like, there's so many ways that as you start to pursue different paths, there are moments where you can see that you're tempted. You can, like, situations arise, offers might arise, and you can get blinded sometimes and make choices based on monetary value, ability to advance, different status. And it's really important that, like, as you're guiding yourself through whatever journey you're going through, you're identifying and you understand, what are my values? What choices would go against my values? And like, anytime that you're making a decision, like how would I feel about this at the end of the day? Sure, we all love to make money. Like, that's great. If you can do that, then good for you. But if you have to do it at the cost of your own values and knowing that you're doing something that's against the version of yourself that you've always wanted to become or how you see yourself, is it worth it?
Dave, that I think leads us into logotherapy perfectly, because what you're talking about here is, so how do you put this into practice, right? So logotherapy is finding your meaning and like becoming who you want to be, like you're talking about. And the way we see it is our choices create our identity. Now you think about these people with nothing they're taking from their jobs, their families, their homes, their friends. And so what are they? Do they have identity? Of course they do. Their identity is the next choice they make. So our choices are our identity. But what you're talking about here is like, okay, how do we make those choices? So part of logotherapy is, how do we discover our ideals and our values and our character? So exactly what you're saying, it's like we have to decide who we want to be and just start being that person.
Yeah.
Like Aristotle says, you are what you do repeatedly. Yeah. So don't be who you don't want to be. So I like, we always end up bringing a patient into this, but I have a patient who is, addicted to porn. And I know that seems like way off topic, but like we talked about how like he's kind of grossed out by like people who look at porn all the time, but he looks at porn every day. So it's like, listen, you can't be grossed out by that and be that. If you have to be who you want to be, and that's not easy. So you are what you repeatedly do. So if you're doing that every day, that's you.
Yeah.
And if you want to change that, you need to face that. Don't deceive yourself and say that's not me. You don't want to be that way, so don't be. That's
one of the biggest issues, I think, with people in society, ourselves probably included at times. I don't think people truly know who they are. And the question really comes down to, well, what are your values? And how many people come into and say, like, I have no idea. And they like don't even understand what that question means sometimes.
Yeah, Dave, us included, though, right? That's why I have
at one point I could honestly say I had no idea. I'd never put thought into that question. I didn't even know really what it meant until it was explained. And I think it's once you explain to someone, I think it's a really important thing to really dig into. I think it's actually, as we're describing logotherapy, I'm like, damn, I wish I knew about this when I was a teenager. Because I think this is actually super effective for teenagers when they're navigating all the choices that are offered to them throughout the day. And I think about a time when in my life, like maybe I was tempted by popularity, getting in with the cool kids, and made decisions that definitely went against who I was. That, you can see that with like any teenager that you talk to, work with, and stuff like that. It's a great question. It's hard. It's a hard question.
It's like, even if you're talking to teenagers or younger people, it's like, well, if you're building a character in a video game, like, what do you want that character to be like?
Yeah.
Like what kind of, and I literally have a list of values in the office on the wall so that, you can kind of look at the values, and there's like 100 of them. I would never be able to name 100 values. And you could look at them and be like, oh, that I identify with that. Oh, that's important to me. And then you kind of list them out and say, these are important to me. I do kind of live based on these values. And just try to do that in your everyday life. Try your best to do that.
So I often describe them as like, these are the non-negotiables. These are the things that if I were to act against them would make me feel very uncomfortable, give me a sense of guilt, give me a sense of shame, embarrassment. So like when you're thinking about like, what are my values? Those are the types of things you're trying to identify. Like, what are the things you feel so strongly on that you don't bend? What are the things that if you were to act against them, just would leave you feeling like, oh, that was a terrible, terrible choice. And I hate that I did that. I think like that's the common thought I would get if like I did something against my values. Like, why did I do that? Or I hate that I did that.
Well, Frankl, and maybe this is a little too simply put, but what you're saying is like, it's so important to live in accordance with your values. And he makes the point. He says that mental well-being exists in the gap of what one is in what one wants to become. So that makes a lot of sense with what you're saying.
Yeah.
Like that when you're existing in a place where you know what you want to be, but you're not being it, that would be like neurosis. That would be like when, anxiety and depression, all these, lower level mental illnesses can present themselves. And I think when we're talking about logotherapy, we have to sort of make clear that this is an existential form of therapy. It's really like putting the onus, like you're driving the bus of your own life. Like the way your life ends up is going to be up to you. And it's going to be your job to find meaning or create your own meaning. And it's like that reel that I made that no one seem to watch. But, does everything happen for a reason? Not really. But can you make a reason for everything that happens? Of course. Like anything that happens in your life, you kind of have to find meaning to make it make sense in your life.
Yeah.
To make your life worthwhile, you have to find meaning. And, what are some paths to creating meaning? Like, how do you do it? I don't know. Like create something like a work, a good deed. I don't know. Like experiencing something like love, beauty, helping people. There's lots of things that you can do to create meaning in your life. And
did I ever tell you about my value of being eco-friendly?
See, I can't. Yeah, no, you haven't told me. Is that for real?
Yeah. Like it's like an almost impossible standard, and I never meet it. But like one thing I do almost obsessively is recycle. Like literally the smallest items to the largest things. Like, and if I see someone litter, it gives me a visceral feeling, especially if it's someone within the party that I'm like within. If I'm hanging out with someone and they leave a cup somewhere, if I have to throw away a plastic cup and not recycle it, it makes me feel uncomfortable because I feel like it's a simple thing that we can all do. I'm getting fired up even thinking about it right now.
Wow. Okay.
That's a value of mine.
Yeah. Like you're like the, what's it? Give a hoot?
Yeah. Give a hoot, don't pollute.
Yeah. That was you. That really hit with you, huh? Back in the 80s?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's just something that was instilled in me as a kid.
Hey, listen, I think it's good. When I see someone throw something out their window, I'm like, wow, people are still doing that. Like, what are you doing?
There's a trash can every like 2 minutes, but also just take it home. Like when I see people throw plastic bottles in the trash at like a gas station, I'm like, you couldn't have just brought that home and recycled it. That really puts you out of your way to do that.
So listen, we're going to talk about a couple more.
I digress.
Let's talk about before we get this turns into an environmental podcast, which would be fine. Let's talk about the reason why this is necessary for one thing, and then a couple more practical uses for logotherapy. So the existential vacuum is this thing that Frankl talks about. And we're not going to go too deep into this, Dave, because we've made this sort of makes sense to us with not before Frankl, but in our own way. He talks about how, for most of human history, we didn't have to make choices for ourselves. And now we live in a world where there's so many choices that we don't know the direction to go in. Everyone can kind of identify with that. And it makes us feel completely meaningless. Like there's no point to do anything. Yeah. And you've made that your Netflix analogy is really good, where you can kind of feel like, you're flipping through all these streaming services and then you get done and it's like, I don't even pick anything, what's the point? Right. Yeah. So you can see how there's
like, put it on regular cable at this point.
Right. But the idea is it doesn't matter which path you take. You just take a path. And if it's the wrong one, whatever, you learn and you move on. Like you just have to constantly be growing. Well, Dave, we could talk about like some of the other ideas that are plaguing people. Like he thinks that hyper intention, like this idea that we focus too hard on the things we want to do. We see a lot in like sexual situations or sleep. Like if you are having insomnia, you are trying so hard to go to sleep that you can't go to sleep. So his answer to that is this paradoxical intention, where they use this all the time with insomnia. It's one of the best methods. And instead of trying all these different things to try to get to sleep, you try to stay awake. You know what I mean? And like that's like you have.
I feel like we talked about that. Effect. We already talked about that once. Did we talk about that in the dream episode?
I don't think we did.
No, it seems like we talked. I feel like we talked about that. Yeah, that's true.
But I'll tell you what. There's that, and then he tells this story about this doctor who his wife died and he couldn't find a way to get over it, and his doctor, like what Frankl says to the doctor is, look, like what would this have been like for your wife if she was the one left alone? And the doctor was like, oh, it would have been terrible for her. She would have been feeling this awful pain that I'm feeling. And Frankl says, well, look, like you've saved her from that. Isn't that something that you can kind of like that made meaning in that situation?
Sure.
And like when people die, like there's a way to make meaning of it, and it's never easy, and especially if it's like children. I think we'll talk about that in a further up the road episode, but making meaning of it, like but like say your grandparent dies, like how would they want me to live? Like how can I honor them?
So,
like these kinds of things are important.
Yeah, that point I often will reflect on with when working with grief. It's like you said, it's like what would they have, how would they have wanted me to live my life? Like what have they instilled in, I think that's another avenue. Is like what have they instilled in me, or how did they impact me, and how do I want to honor them by going forward? And it's also important to kind of reflect on the fact that if you loved someone and they were impactful in your life, they're always with you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like it's exactly that idea of like if they were impactful, that means you probably learned something from them. I was having a conversation recently with an individual whose wife is passing away, and he was feeling so hopeless, and he's scared because he feels like he doesn't know what to do without her, as far as like raising the kids and stuff like that. And as he's speaking, I'm like, there's no way. Like everything you're reflecting to me just shows how impactful this person was in your life. And like, I guarantee you could probably pre-predict at this point what that person would probably say to your kids in like a situation that you maybe in the past wouldn't have known how to handle. Like you learn from them. So how do you start to utilize that more? Like thinking about that person and how would they have supported you in these situations and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's like you have to sort of do that, don't you?
Yeah.
I'm kind of, and there's like, how do you overcome like such tragedy in life? Like in these, like obviously Frankl had to do it in this horrible situation. It's like, but in some way, it's like you get stronger through these things. Like there's strength in suffering, strength through suffering, right? So I don't know. Like I think that like, there's opposing theories that what really drives human nature. Is it the will to power, like Adler would think, or Nietzsche? Is it survival? Is it our desires, like Freud would think? Or was Frankl right? Like this idea that the will to find meaning, that's what drives humans. Like, is that what we are? We're like meaning-making machines. I think that's what we have to be.
Yeah.
That's why there's religion. That's why there's stories. That's why we make sense of things. We give things meaning. Like we couldn't just exist on Earth and not create like origin stories and urban legends and folklore and religion. Like if our drive wasn't to create meaning, none of that would exist. And without any of that, like think about how much those things gotten through people through things. Like you talk about, death and grief, how much, people could say what they want about religion, but that's gotten people through these things, right? Finding meaning has given us a reason to be here, like whether it be the real reason or not. It's just interesting that that's what we are.
So Frankl identifies like three ways that we can find our why, and they're highlighted in Man's Search for Meaning. So one of them, and I don't know if you would prioritize or give a ranking of importance. I don't think that's even necessary. But one of the big ones is love. So he felt that the salvation of man is through love and in love. And for him, much of what got him through the times at the concentration camp were the thoughts and the memories of his wife and how they stayed with him throughout the time that he was there. So there was like that idea of like, I can't wait to see her smile again. Even in like the deepest depths of his mind, he knows realistically, I might never see her. The hope, the idea that he may get that opportunity is so strong that it powers him through, right?
Dave, like, what if,
that will.
And I hate to put you on the spot, and Frankl, but what if like you don't feel like you love someone? Does everyone love someone?
I think that we can all probably identify some sort of connection, but it's not just love. So, I mean, the other whys could be that. So he identifies it as like work, but I think it's like more, not just the work that like would come to mind for us. So I think
I don't know. Yeah,
like
and I agree with you there. I do agree with you there. But that said, we have, you have a depressed patient and they start working. Even if it's like a menial job that they don't really love, it does spark something.
Unless they lost their job because they didn't get out of bed.
Well, then
they're more depressed.
Right. Right.
and it backfired.
Right. But listen, then the advice is always going to be, you need to get back to work.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, but work could, in this day and age too, we got to think outside the box. It's like work is not just a 9 to 5 going to some building, and work looks different. And people are self-employed these days, and entrepreneurs. It looks different. That's why I'm saying, like, I don't think it's just the general idea that we might have for work. It could be, it's just like that thing that
Action.
you're trying. Yeah, that thing that you're trying to do that you feel sparks something in you, or that gives you a feeling of like, I'm creating, or I'm
and it's
giving.
in line with your values, right?
Yes. Yeah. 100%. And a lot of times there's a bigger meaning to it. So it might be like, even the most mundane jobs have some purpose in our society, right? Even a factory job, even if it's just like line work, you're creating something. And if you think about it from a bigger scale, it's to value somebody's life in the end.
So I hate how we like put these like rankings on what jobs are important, what jobs aren't. So, but my a good friend of mine, he works at a liquor store, and I think I've talked about him before in the past. But some people in his life, like maybe his girlfriend, whatever, have like sort of looked down on what he does. But it's like when he goes there, like he's lighting up people's days, not just because he's selling them alcohol, but like
he's getting them lit.
Right. He's having these conversations every day, and people love to come in and see him, and he changes their mood when they come in there. And how is that not meaningful?
Yeah. You know what job I always wanted?
Great.
I always wanted to have a bartending job.
Me too.
More because I love the idea that like people come in and you chit chat with them as if like you're talking to a best friend or a therapist or a family member. Like the bartender is like the life of the place, the establishment. And I love that idea that they I never was a bartender, and probably is a good choice to not be for me. But it was such an appealing thing because I just think they bring so much value to people.
Dave, like another book that we've done in the past, early on, maybe the first or second episode, and there's a lot of like tie-in with this. When I'm reading over this book, I think of The Alchemist.
Yeah.
Even the conversations that we're having now, it's like,
well, you brought up Liquor Guy at The Alchemist. That's why.
Well, wow.
Yeah. You did. I remember that.
So that's exactly, just finding meaning in what you're doing, working towards something that's meaningful to you. And that's when like happiness or self-actualization, what I mean by that is like, becoming who you want to be. Like none of that happens. It's not a place where you end up. It happens while you're working towards something meaningful to you, while you're searching for meaning. That's when these things happen. So if you're on a path and you're working towards something that you think is important, that's it. That's all there is.
So
the
for Frankl,
not important.
For Frankl, his thing is just that he really encouraged people to aim for something bigger than themselves, right? So this is like, again, it comes back to that idea of how we contribute to society or to other lives. I don't even think it has to be to society, because some people might hate that saying, I guess. But just like that we contribute to others and not just all about ourselves. Because I think that his feeling about that is that's like a really empty thing. And it doesn't give you value. Like it's great to feel like, hey, I made this money, or I have this job, and it pays me all right. But it's like it misses that feeling you get where you're also contributing to something larger than who you are. And the last why that, I think we can kind of determine what this means is dignity. And I think that that's one that is interesting to me, because what exactly, if I say that to you, Greg, what would you take that as?
Well, I think it makes me think of when he's writing in the book about how he felt when he wasn't treated with respect. And I think that it's so important that we treat each other with respect, because when you feel like you're disrespected or unseen, or people don't see your worth, that's not just bad. It's like dangerous, because what that does is it creates anger. And so I think, treating people with respect is going to help them feel good, which is going to help you feel good.
Yeah.
And it makes me think of like that, so I was going to ask you, Dave, like, what is there a meaning to life, or, what is the meaning to life? And I think like, that's kind of it. It's, the meaning to life is finding meaning in your life, right? And treating other people the way you want to be treated, and living in accordance with your values, and doing the most amount of good for the most amount of people. Like, this is what it's all about.
I also think it represents being good to yourself, not understanding that you are worthwhile and that like you deserve also to have dignity and to be treated respectfully. And sometimes we can be so hard on ourselves, and we are our own worst enemies, and we can be the thing that holds us back from better things in life, or just even just being somewhat happy or enjoying our moments. So I think that the dignity thing can definitely go for our actions towards others, but also our actions towards ourselves. Like, it's okay to take care of yourself.
Yeah, and he'll talk about that. Like,
you know,
when he said, I think that's what he's talking about when he says, you know, you can't control the things that happen to you. The last great human freedom is being able to choose your attitude in any situation. So people can treat you however they want. But if you have like the feelings of yourself that feel good enough about yourself to say, you know what, I'm going to decide how that makes me feel. That's a very important, huge thing.
There's a little bit about individuality that I think is important to shine a light on here. I really like this idea of, so he says life ultimately means taking responsibility to find the right answers to its problems and to fill the tasks it constantly sets for each individual. And then he kind of poses the question, like, what does life expect of you? But I love that he points out to each individual, meaning we each have our own individual journey. And I know I mentioned that earlier, like our meanings are all going to be different because we're all different individuals. And it made me think of this idea as individuality, of how important that is to like really make sure we understand and we're aware of our own individuality. I do feel like it's a curse that we have this ability to compare ourselves to others constantly, and that there's no, like, it really is like our downfall is the fact that we dwell so much on meeting the standards based on how we see others. And I think that can be something that sets us back so far. And it like, I feel like it fuels greed, it fuels envy, it fuels so many negative feelings. Like, there's very little that's good about comparing ourselves to others unless we use it to motivate ourselves to be a better version of ourselves.
But even still, it's like, I totally agree with what you're saying.
That's not that's not a good way to come to that determination, though, right?
You know, like, I'm thinking, obviously, when you're talking, I'm thinking of like social media, Instagram, stuff like that. But when you do that, when you're comparing yourself to others and being in awe of their individuality and what makes their life meaningful and what's important about them, then you lose sight of that special thing that's great about you, which, you know, which maybe hasn't shown its head yet. Like, maybe there's something that's down the road. Like, you know, like Van Gogh didn't sell a painting while he was alive. Like, there's things about you that you might think that are terrible, or you might not like the way you look, you might not like the way you think, but there's something about you that's going to be useful at some point. And that thing that you hate about yourself might be the best thing about you. And, you know, we've seen that in people. We've seen that, you know, in that great Eeyore story where, you know, Eeyore falls in the water, and because Tigger knocked him over, and he's like, everyone's so annoyed with him, so they take him to the woods, they leave him there, and they realize that now that they're lost in the woods, they need that thing about Tigger that was so annoying, the fact that he can jump so high, you know, and see over the trees. Like, now all of a sudden they need him. So it's like, that thing, people should remember that individual, that thing that makes you an individual, that thing that maybe you don't like right now, especially when you're young and you don't understand it. Like, that's what's important about you. That could be so useful. Just give it time. Give it time. And like you said, like, the corniest statement ever about, you know, you gotta love yourself. I hate saying that, but it's like, you gotta find a way to do that.
Yeah, and if you can't love yourself, at least like yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a good start.
It's a start. Right? Yeah. No, it's so interesting because we all do it to some extent. We all compare ourselves to others, but I think it becomes so problematic when it's like, it just becomes our whole outlook of who we are is based on a comparison of ourselves to versions of something that we sometimes don't even know. I remember I was in a session with a guy, and he just kept telling me, like, I'm not at this stage of my life. Like, I'm not where I wanted to be here. I'm not like how I saw myself here. And I'm like, who are you comparing yourself to? Because all these standards that you set, there's like an ideal person that you're talking about, and you're not even like, you don't even know who that person is. And like, that's just like this imaginary person almost, because I don't even think that person exists in the world that like,
well, like
has all these benchmarkers set for themselves.
The standards of beauty now are based on people who aren't even like real people. I mean, you're looking at, I don't want to like cause a ruckus with the Kardashians or whatever, but I mean,
dude, you and the Kardashians, you just
I'm coming for everybody. I just
no, you're not just the Kardashians.
Yeah, just them. But like I they know. So it's like, Photoshop and surgery and then there's like young women who we talk to and they're trying to look like that. It's like, that's not a real thing, like that's not, you can spend all the time in the gym you want, but like you can't become that. That's not reality. I hate that. I hate that exists. And like, you never feel good enough because you're looking at, it's, that's going to rear its ugly head at some point.
We do it to ourselves though.
Yeah.
Because we have created this, like we praise model, like we have a whole industry of models, of modeling and fashion and like stuff that sets the standard that people not in that industry are not going to achieve. And then we just sit there and be like, oh, I wish I was like that.
Sad. But I think have we gone off track?
I don't know. Maybe not. So yeah, I guess that is a wrap on Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah, hopefully we did this thing justice. And like, just like always, maybe we didn't get.
I don't think you could, because there's so many things to extract from this book that like people just need to read it and make their own meaning from it.
Exactly.
And hope we're giving our interpretation and our meanings that we've extracted from it. We're giving actually the highlights of the things that I think we find to be the most useful tools in the work that we do. But like, anybody could read this. And surprisingly, a lot of people have read this already. That actually surprises me. I get a lot of people that I'll be like, have you ever read this book? And they'll be like, yeah, I did actually. I'm like, really?
And it's short. It's short.
Yeah, it's super digestible. So that always surprises me, but I think it's important for our people to read it and like also not be reading it from our perspective sometimes. Because we're reading it from a purpose of like, hey, this is a great tool to use. Also,
a couple of fanboys.
Yeah. But I think other people will read it and they might get a different message out of it that's also super helpful. So
yeah. Exactly. Like, how does this apply in your own life? And the only way to do that is to get the text and it'll sort of, like we've talked about before, it'll like dawn on you as you read it.
Yeah.
It has a funny way of doing that. That's why I sold millions of copies. It's like one of the most influential books ever written. It's very important. And if we do nothing else, if you're upset with our interpretation of it or whatever it is, like, we are just trying to get people to become more interested in these topics. Never claiming to be an expert. Tough to become an expert on something in a week, even though, we've dealt with this book a lot, but trying our best, hopefully doing a good job.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. We do appreciate it. If you feel obliged, we'd love to hear feedback. So feel free to either reach out to us, or you could always leave a review and a rating on Apple or wherever else they allow for those. And we just, like Greg said, we're always trying to strive to do better and to provide the type of content that we feel you deserve. So thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Have a great day.
No, I like it.
Good enough.
It's good enough, man. It's good enough.